Howdy, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Section 18 of belonging again. We've been exploring different possible sources of belonging and rest, trying to find out what could ground communities today and provide people with existential stability. We've been talking constantly about the trade-off between lowering the probability, the banality of evil, but then creating the conditions of existential destabilization that make totalitarianism appealing. So it's a very difficult almost Greek tragedy that we're having to deal with on the formulation of societies. We just spoke about in section 17 if rationality could be the new ground of identity, and here we're talking about activism. There's certainly social injustices in the world that activism needs to work to correct, and there are a lot of people who are identifying with activist movements, movements for justice, movements to correct wrongs, and the question is, can that provide a community? You could, it's not usually seen as activism, but you could have conservatives, say, who follow Trump, who believe that they're going to make America great again. That's a form of kind of activism. You have progressive movements that directly think of themselves as activists, and the question is this a place where one can find belonging? A world without activism would be very problematic. We would not have the civil, we would not have overcome the Jim Crow South, a lot of the racism. Activism in China can help some oppressed groups, so activism is very, very important. The question is, can activism be a community? Well, activism, precisely by definition, requires a problem in order to be itself, in order to arise. There has to be an injustice. So it's an inherently tense relationship. There is a problem, and the activists are trying to solve it. Now, that in of itself right there means the structure of activism could in of itself be a tension. And in order to get belonging and rest, there can't be that kind of tension. Now, again, this is kind of similar to the question of if purpose can give us belonging, and we have to keep in mind that if we go too far in the direction of givens, we can end up in belonging in the banality of evil. But simultaneously, if we go too far in the direction of constant action, we can also end up in an existential destabilization, of which we can turn to totalitarianism. And that's another problem that can happen with activism. Activism in its desperation, or can get to a place where it appeals to the state in order to correct the injustice. But as we've discussed, the state, precisely in its doctrine of tolerance versus humility, can reduce the authority that local communities or communities have in the name of the state. And the state, we've already discussed, doesn't seem like it can be a ground for an identity because it is too abstract. And so if activism, in order to end an injustice, appeals to the state, then it can weaken the conditions that make rest and belonging possible by favoring the solidness of an abstraction. Now, again, without activism, if a banality of evil forms, there's not going to be people to oppose it, and we should want communities that cause the banality of evil. We should want those communities to be erased, and this is why activism is important. However, it would seem as if activism is more so an act than it can be a identity, if you will. Like, activism is something that needs to arise when a problem arises, get rid of the problem, and then go back to rest. It needs to cease being. But you see, the issue is, if people find identity in activism, then there will be an incentive to keep activism alive and to keep it constant, even if there theoretically were no injustices. Now, one could argue there are always injustices, and that's a fair point. But the point is that if activism in its very structure requires there to be a problem, well, then there has to be a tension. That tension could keep there from being the banality of evil, but it will also make it difficult for there to be belonging. So it would seem as if activism needs to be a thing that arises, addresses the problem, and then fades away, or it goes back into rest almost. It's almost like you need to have activism or action go into rest so that then belonging can provide rest, whereas when action is emerging in order to stop an injustice, that's going to be precisely when there isn't rest. But for good reason, there shouldn't be rest. So this would all suggest that efforts to correct the world, end injustices, are necessary, but they themselves cannot be sources of belonging. Or they almost by definition have to be temporary, and if they're not temporary, then they're creating instability constantly, which can lead to unintended consequence, or it can't lead to belonging. So it would seem like, just like rationality and critical thinking, it is necessary, but in of itself cannot address the problem of belonging. And also, activism could also lead to the internal destabilization of a society. Well, the more a society becomes internally destable, perhaps for very good reason to stop discrimination, xenophobia, and so on, that could create incentive of the state or the larger government to become more militant or to exercise its power precisely to stabilize its own country. So you might get state action, which would be bad and could go in the direction of totalitarianism. Or you could have the state, pick a fight with an outside enemy in order to convince its own people that it's stronger than it actually is. Kind of an internal propaganda, which is arguably, say, in 2016, when the oil markets are collapsing and Russia invades Ukraine, that can almost function as a kind of propaganda on your own people to tell them that you're stronger than it seems, precisely because you are military engaged with an outside force. So internal destabilization in this way can potentially lead to external conflict or aggression. So again, that's a risk of activism, but then of course, if there's no activism, well, then racism doesn't get stopped. So you have this tension. So to the question of can activism be a ground of community or identity, it would seem like it is more so an action, a necessary action. But itself cannot constitute a community. And if it did begin to somehow constitute a community, well, then it would be a potential source of belonging and rest, but that would also mean that it could become its own source of givens and thus the banality of evil in its own way. So then activism would, in a way, stop being an action primarily, even if it was still called activism, and become a community, which then would just be at risk of making the same mistakes and having the same benefits as other communities. So it would lose its distinction, and in losing that distinction, could not be a unique source to the problem of belonging. So again, like critical thinking and rationality, activism seems necessary, but not able to completely solve the problem of belonging, even though it is a necessary corrective. So anyway, that's section 18. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.